"You don't belong here," Daniel Carter said, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of the store like a blade on glass. And for a second, even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to hesitate above aisle 3 as Marcus Reed stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from the hem of his worn jacket onto the polished tile, forming a small dark halo around his shoes while customers slowed their carts without meaning to, their eyes flicking over him the way people look at something they don't want to see but can't ignore. And Marcus didn't move. Not yet. Just held the door open long enough for the cold March air to slip in behind him before letting it shut with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like the end of something nobody had agreed to begin. And the smell hit him next. Burnt coffee mixed with sweet artificial vanilla from the pastry case. Warm, familiar, almost comforting in a way that didn't belong to him anymore, while Daniel stepped out from behind the counter, straightening his black manager's apron as if that alone gave him ownership of the air between them. "We've had complaints," he added, louder now, not because he needed to, but because he wanted everyone to hear. And a woman near the register shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study the menu board while her kid stopped mid-sip of a milkshake, straw frozen between his lips, eyes wide in that unfiltered way children have before they learn how to look away. And Marcus finally lifted his head, slow, deliberate, his face calm but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from sleep. And he spoke quietly, not matching the volume thrown at him. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice steady, almost too steady, like it had practiced being ignored. "I just want a cup of hot coffee, the cheapest one you've got." And for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across Daniel's face, something small and quickly buried. But then it was gone, replaced with a smirk that spread like it had been waiting its turn. "Coffee," Daniel repeated, glancing over his shoulder at the line forming behind the counter as if inviting them into the joke before it even landed. "You planning to pay for that?" And a few quiet chuckles slipped out, soft at first, testing the room, then a little louder when no one stopped them, while Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, fingers moving slowly, carefully, like every motion had weight, and pulled out a folded bill, edges worn thin, the green faded from too many hands or too many years, and held it between two fingers without raising it high, not presenting it, just showing it existed. "I have enough," he said, and the room didn't go silent. Not yet, but something in the air shifted, like a current, changing direction just beneath the surface. And Daniel leaned forward onto the counter, resting his elbows as he looked at the bill, then at Marcus, then back at the bill again, stretching the moment just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "That all you've got?" he asked, voice dipping into something sharper, something that wanted to press, to expose. And Marcus didn't answer right away, his thumb brushing the edge of the bill as if feeling its texture mattered more than the question. And somewhere to the side, a teenage employee paused mid-wipe, cloth hovering over a stainless steel surface that reflected the overhead lights in cold strips, while the kid with the milkshake whispered something to his mother, who gently pulled him closer without taking her eyes off the scene. And Daniel straightened suddenly, clapping his hands once, loud, drawing attention like a performer about to deliver a punchline. "Tell you what," he said, voice rising, playful in a way that didn't feel kind. "If you've got $5, $5 whole, I'll quit my job right now." And the words landed with a sharpness that echoed, bouncing off the glass display cases and tile floor. And for a split second there was hesitation, like the room wasn't sure how to react. But then the laughter came, uneven at first, then building, people looking at each other, feeding off the shared permission to find it funny, to make it harmless by turning it into entertainment. And Marcus didn't laugh, didn't even flinch, just stood there with that same steady gaze, his hand lowering slowly until the bill rested at his side again, while Daniel spread his arms slightly, basking in the response. "Come on," he added, grinning now. "Show us what you've got." And Marcus inhaled quietly, the kind of breath that fills the chest without drawing attention, and slid his hand back into his pocket, deeper this time, fingers searching, not hurried, not desperate, just precise, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly where it should be. And the laughter began to taper, not because anyone told it to stop, but because something about the way he moved didn't match the joke anymore. And near the end of the counter, the teenage employee set the cloth down completely, hands still, watching, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady, indifferent, casting everything in that same cold brightness that made every detail visible. The worn stitching on Marcus's sleeve, the faint crease in Daniel's brow as his smile held just a fraction too long. And somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the front windows, reflecting off the glass and sliding over Marcus's face for the briefest moment before disappearing, leaving him standing there again, quiet, composed, his hand still inside his pocket as if the next thing he did would matter more than anything anyone had said so far. Marcus's fingers closed around something smaller this time, something that did not crinkle like paper but clicked faintly against his nail as he brought it out, and the sound was quiet, almost lost under the low murmur of the store, yet it carried enough to pull a few eyes tighter onto him, while Daniel tilted his head, amused but watchful now. The grin still there but thinner, like it had been stretched too far, and Marcus opened his palm slowly, revealing 2 coins, dull from use, 1 quarter, and 1 dime, their edges worn smooth. And he did not rush, did not try to impress, just placed them carefully on the counter as if each one had a place and a purpose, and the metal made a soft tap against the laminate surface, small but precise, while somewhere behind him the door chimed again as another customer stepped in and immediately slowed, sensing something in the air that did not match the usual rhythm of orders and receipts. And Daniel let out a short laugh, sharper this time. "That is not $5, he said, glancing over his shoulder as if inviting the room to agree. But fewer people laughed now, fewer voices joining in, because the moment had stretched into something unfamiliar, something that did not quite fit the joke anymore, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the obvious without surrendering anything to it, then reached back into his pocket again, deeper this time, his shoulder shifting slightly under the damp fabric of his jacket, and when his hand came back out, it held more coins, a few pennies, another quarter, each one placed beside the others with the same careful motion, building something slow and deliberate, not hurried, not desperate, just steady. And the counter began to fill with small circles of metal that caught the overhead light in dull flashes, and the teenage employee leaned closer without realizing it, elbows now resting on the stainless steel edge, eyes fixed on the growing line of coins as if watching a story unfold that he could not quite name, while the child with the milkshake lowered his cup, completely still now, straw slipping from his lips as he whispered, "Is he going to do it?" And his mother did not answer, because she did not know, and neither did anyone else in the room, and Daniel's fingers tapped once against the counter, a habit he did not notice but could not stop, the rhythm uneven, betraying something just beneath the surface. "You are wasting everyone's time," he said, though his voice did not carry the same easy confidence it had before, and Marcus paused, just for a second, his hand hovering over his pocket as if considering that statement. Then he looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes directly, not challenging, not pleading, just present. "I am paying," he said simply, and the words did not rise, did not push, they just settled into the space between them. And that was enough to quiet the last few scattered chuckles. And somewhere near the back, a man in a business suit shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how loud his earlier laughter had sounded, while Marcus reached in again and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not a bill this time, but something thinner, more fragile, and for a moment it looked like nothing, like trash, until he smoothed it gently against the counter, revealing the edge of a $1 bill, creased and worn, and he added it to the small pile without comment. And the total was still not enough, not yet, but it was closer, and the distance between what he had and what he needed had become visible, measurable, undeniable, and Daniel's smile flickered again. Not gone, but unsettled, like a light that could not decide whether to stay on. "You really think this is going to work?" he asked, quieter now, not projecting to the room but directing it at Marcus alone, and Marcus did not answer right away, his fingers returning to his pocket one more time, slower now, as if reaching for something that mattered more than the rest, and when he pulled his hand out, he did not open it immediately, just held it there for a breath, 2 breaths, letting the silence grow thick enough that even the hum of the refrigeration unit seemed distant, and then he opened his palm, and inside was a small, folded photograph, its edges soft from being handled too often, and for a second, the room seemed to tilt, not physically, but emotionally. as if something invisible had shifted beneath everyone's feet, and Marcus looked at it briefly, just a glance, before placing it carefully beside the money, not as payment, not as part of the count, but as something. That explained why the count mattered at all, and the image caught the light just enough for those closest to see a child's face, smiling, bright, frozen in a moment that felt warmer than anything in the store, and Marcus's thumb rested on the edge of the photo for a second longer than necessary before he withdrew his hand, and when he did, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out one last coin, a nickel this time, the metal catching the light as it turned between his fingers, and he placed it down with the others, completing the small arrangement with a final, soft click, and then he looked up, not at the crowd, not at the child, but directly at Daniel, his expression unchanged, steady, calm. "Keep counting," he said, and the words were not a challenge, not a demand, just an invitation to see what was already there, and Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before his eyes dropped to the counter, scanning the coins, the bill, the small, worn pieces that together began to form something larger than their value, and the room held its breath without knowing it was doing so. Every sound muted, every movement paused, as if the outcome of this quiet, ordinary act had suddenly become the only thing that mattered. Daniel's eyes moved over the counter slowly, not with the quick, dismissive glance he had given before, but with a careful, almost reluctant focus, as if each coin demanded acknowledgement now, and his fingers hovered just above the surface before finally lowering, nudging the nearest quarter into a small cluster with the others, the soft scrape of metal against laminate sounding louder than it should in the quiet. And he began to count under his breath, not announcing it, not performing it, just saying the numbers for himself, 25, 35, 60, 85. And the room leaned in without moving. Every person pulled closer by the rhythm of those small increments, and Marcus did not interrupt, did not rush him, just stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides, shoulders relaxed despite the weight of every eye in the store resting on him, while the photograph lay still beside the money, its presence quiet but undeniable, like a second voice that did not need to speak. And Daniel reached the dollar bill, smoothing it again as if to confirm it was real, then continued, 185, 210, 230, and his voice slowed, the confidence thinning as the total climbed, and somewhere behind Marcus, the teenage employee shifted forward another inch, his breath held without realizing it, while the child near the register whispered again, softer this time, "It is real," and his mother nodded faintly, her eyes never leaving the counter, and Daniel's hand paused when he reached the last coin, the nickel placed with care at the edge of the small arrangement, and he stared at it for a moment longer than necessary, as if that final piece carried more weight than the rest, and then he added it, his voice barely above a whisper now, 235, and the numbers settled into the space between them, incomplete, insufficient, and for a brief second something like relief flickered across his face. Quick and subtle, the kind of reaction that comes when a challenge falls short just enough to restore control, and he leaned back slightly, the familiar shape of his earlier confidence beginning to return. "That is not $5, he said again, this time quieter, almost conversational, as if the moment could now be closed, wrapped up, dismissed, and a few people in the store exhaled softly, the tension easing just a fraction, but Marcus did not move, did not reach for the money, did not look away. He simply tilted his head slightly, eyes still steady, and then he spoke, just one sentence, "You stopped too early." And the words did not accuse, did not challenge, they just corrected, and Daniel frowned, his brow tightening as he looked back down at the counter, scanning the coins again, the bill, the small details he might have missed, and then his gaze landed on the photograph, the piece he had not counted, the piece he had ignored, and he hesitated, uncertain now, because it did not belong in the total, it was not money, it was not part of the game he had created, and yet it sat there among the coins as if it carried its own kind of value, and Marcus followed his gaze, then reached forward slowly, lifting the photograph just enough to slide it closer to Daniel, not offering it as payment, but as something to be seen. "Look at it," he said, and his voice remained calm, but there was something deeper in it now, something that pulled rather than pushed, and Daniel hesitated again, then picked it up, his fingers careful despite himself, And for the first time since the moment began, his expression changed in a way he could not control, the edges of his smirk dissolving completely as he looked down at the image, and the room did not know what he saw, but they saw the effect of it, the way his shoulders lowered slightly, the way his breath shifted, slower, heavier, and Marcus spoke again, not to the room, not to anyone else, just to Daniel. Every coin on that counter came from a different person, he said. Someone who decided I was worth at least that much. And the words settled into the silence with a weight that no laughter could carry away. And Daniel's grip on the photograph tightened just slightly, not enough to crease it, but enough to show that something inside him had shifted, and Marcus continued, his tone unchanged. You asked for $5, he said. But you made it about more than money. And Daniel's eyes lifted slowly, meeting Marcus's again, and this time there was no humor in them, no performance, just a quiet, uneasy recognition of something he had not expected to face. And behind him, the teenage employee straightened fully, no longer pretending to work, no longer looking away, while the child stepped a little closer to the counter, his small hand resting against the edge as if he wanted to be part of what was happening without interrupting it. And Daniel swallowed once, the movement subtle but visible, and he looked back down at the counter, at the coins, the bill, the photograph, and then around the store, at the faces that had been laughing just moments ago, now watching him instead, waiting, and the silence that filled the space was no longer empty. It was full, heavy, expectant, and for the first time since he had spoken, Daniel did not know what to say. Daniel set the photograph down carefully, not where it had been but slightly closer to himself, as if its position now mattered, and his fingers lingered on its edge before pulling back, slow, uncertain, while the overhead lights continued their quiet hum, steady, indifferent, illuminating every detail that could no longer be ignored, and he cleared his throat once, the sound small but sharp in the silence, then looked back at Marcus with an expression that no longer belonged to the moment he had started. That still is not $5, he said, but the words landed differently now, softer, thinner, as if even he did not fully believe in their weight anymore. And Marcus nodded once, accepting the statement without resistance, then stepped forward just half an inch, not crossing any boundary, but narrowing the distance enough that the conversation felt contained, direct, unavoidable. No, he said quietly, it is not. And the agreement did not restore control the way Daniel expected. It only deepened the space between what had been said and what was actually happening. And Daniel glanced down again at the coins, the bill, the photograph, then back at Marcus, searching for something to hold on to, something familiar, but the room no longer gave it to him, because no one laughed, no one filled the silence for him this time. And behind the counter, the teenage employee reached for a stack of paper cups without taking his eyes off the scene, his hands moving automatically while his attention stayed fixed, and the child near the register shifted closer still, his small fingers now gripping the edge of the counter, as if he did not want to miss what came next. And Marcus spoke again, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. You said if I had $5, you would quit, he said, and Daniel's jaw tightened slightly at the reminder, a reflex more than a decision, and Marcus continued. But that was never the real question, and he gestured lightly toward the counter, toward the small collection of coins that had drawn everyone in. Because you already decided what I was worth before you asked, and the words settled, slowly, like something sinking through water, reaching deeper than the surface of the exchange, and Daniel's eyes flickered, not away, but inward, as if something in that statement had found its mark, and he shifted his weight, the movement subtle but enough to break the rigid stance he had held behind the counter, and for the first time, he looked around the room, really looked, at the customers, at the employees, at the faces that had been part of the laughter and were now part of the silence. And he saw something different in them, not amusement, not agreement, but expectation, and that realization landed heavier than anything Marcus had said, and he looked back down at the photograph once more, the small, worn image that had changed the shape of the moment without raising its voice, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding without knowing it, and Marcus reached forward then, not to take the money back, not to end the moment, but to slide the photograph back toward himself, his fingers careful, respectful, as if returning something to its proper place. and he tucked it back into his jacket pocket with the same deliberate motion he had used before, and when his hand came back out, it was empty, open, nothing hidden, nothing left to prove, and he looked at Daniel again, his gaze steady, unhurried. "I did not come here to take your job," he said, and the sentence carried no edge, no triumph, just truth. "I came here for a cup of coffee." And the simplicity of it cut through the complexity that had built around them, reducing the moment to something smaller and somehow more significant at the same time. And Daniel blinked once, the motion slow, as if recalibrating, and his eyes dropped once more to the counter, to the coins, that now felt heavier than their value. And then, without announcing it, without performing it, he reached out and gathered them together, not sweeping them away but collecting them gently into a small pile, his fingers moving with a care that had not been there before, and he slid the pile back toward Marcus, stopping just short of his reach, and the gesture was small, almost invisible if you were not watching closely, but the room felt it. The shift in direction, the quiet reversal that did not need a declaration, and Daniel straightened, not taller, not prouder, just different, and his voice, when he spoke again, was no longer aimed at the room, no longer seeking approval or laughter. It was directed at Marcus alone. "The coffee is on me," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something new, something that had not been there before, and for a moment, Marcus did not move, as if letting the statement settle fully before responding, and then he gave a small nod, not grateful in a way that diminished him, not triumphant in a way that elevated him, just acknowledging the moment for what it was, and he stepped forward the remaining distance, placing his hand lightly on the counter, and the teenage employee, almost without thinking, reached for a cup, filling it with fresh coffee, the steam rising in soft curls that caught the overhead light, and he set it down carefully, closer to Marcus than to Daniel, as if he understood where it belonged now, and Marcus picked it up, the warmth settling into his hands, grounding, real, and he held it there for a second before turning slightly toward the door, and as he did, the child by the register lifted his hand in a small, instinctive wave, and Marcus paused just long enough to see it, to return it with the slightest lift of his own fingers, and then he walked toward the exit, his steps quiet, steady, leaving behind a counter covered in coins that no longer looked small, and a room that had learned something it could not easily forget, and Daniel remained where he was, standing behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on its surface, not gripping it, not claiming it, just there, as the hum of the lights returned to its usual place in the background, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of understanding that had arrived without permission and would not leave without being felt. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click that seemed to linger longer than it should have, and for a moment no one moved, not the customers, not the employees, not even Daniel, who stood still behind the counter with his hands resting lightly on the surface, as if he had forgotten what they were supposed to do next, and the coffee machine hissed quietly in the background, steam escaping in short bursts that broke the silence, just enough to remind everyone that the world had not stopped. Even if something inside that room had shifted in a way none of them could name, and the teenage employee finally picked up the cloth again, though he did not wipe anything, just held it, his eyes still on the door, as if expecting Marcus to walk back in and continue something unfinished, while the child near the register tugged gently on his mother's sleeve, whispering something too soft to hear, and she nodded slowly, her gaze distant now, thoughtful, as if replaying the moment from a different angle, and Daniel exhaled, a long breath that seemed to come from deeper than his chest, and he looked down at the counter again, at the faint circular marks left by the coins that had been there, the slight smudge where the dollar bill had rested, the place where the photograph had briefly changed everything, and he ran his hand across the surface, not to clean it, but to feel it, as if trying to understand how something so small could leave such a weight behind, and one of the customers cleared his throat, shifting his stance, breaking the stillness just enough for the store to begin moving again, slowly at first, then with more familiarity, the line at the register reforming, orders being placed in quieter voices, the normal rhythm returning but altered, like a song played at a different tempo, and Daniel straightened, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, something in between, and he reached for the register, pressing a few buttons without looking at them, muscle memory guiding him while his mind stayed somewhere else, and the teenage employee stepped closer, hesitating for a second before speaking. "That was something," he said, his voice low, unsure if it was appropriate to fill the space. And Daniel did not answer right away, just nodded once, almost to himself, before finally responding, "Yeah." And the word carried more weight than its size suggested, and he glanced toward the door again, the glass reflecting the street outside where Marcus had disappeared into the afternoon, blending back into a world that would not stop for him. And something tightened in Daniel's chest, not sharp, not painful, just present, and he turned back to the counter, focusing on the next customer, a middle-aged man who placed his order without meeting his eyes, his tone polite but distant, and Daniel completed the transaction quickly, efficiently, handing over the receipt with a small nod, and the man took it without comment, stepping aside, and the next customer approached, then the next, and the store continued, but the energy had changed, quieter, more aware, as if everyone had seen something they were still trying to process, and, between orders, Daniel's gaze kept drifting back to the spot on the counter where the coins had been, as if expecting them to still be there, as if their absence was as noticeable as their presence had been, and after a few minutes, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small paper cup, filling it halfway with coffee before setting it aside, not for a customer, not for himself, just placing it there, untouched, and the teenage employee noticed, glancing at it briefly before looking back at Daniel, who did not explain, did not need to, and outside. The sky had shifted slightly, clouds moving across the sun, casting a softer light through the front windows, and Daniel watched it for a moment, the reflection on the glass changing, and in that reflection, he caught a glimpse of himself, not the version he had been performing earlier, but something quieter, less certain, and he held that gaze for a second longer than necessary before looking away, returning to the steady routine of the store, but now each motion felt more deliberate, more conscious, as if he was aware of how easily a moment could turn, how quickly a sentence could reshape everything around it. And the teenage employee finally spoke again, softer this time. "Do you think he will come back?" And Daniel paused, his hand hovering over the register keys, considering the question, not dismissing it. And then he shook his head slightly, not in certainty, but in acceptance. "I do not know," he said, and the honesty in his voice was new, unguarded. And he glanced once more at the door, the glass reflecting the quiet street beyond, and for the first time, he did not see it as a boundary, but as a passage, something that connected the world inside to the one outside, and he wondered, briefly, what it would feel like to step through it differently than before, to carry something with him instead of leaving it behind. And the coffee in the small cup cooled slowly, untouched, its surface still, reflecting the overhead lights in a soft, steady glow, while the store continued around it, changed in a way that no one would mention out loud, but no one would forget either. The small paper cup sat where Daniel had left it, untouched, a thin ribbon of steam no longer rising from its surface, and yet he kept glancing at it between orders as if it carried a question he had not answered. And the afternoon moved forward in quiet increments, the line thinning, the voices soft, the usual rush replaced by something slower, more deliberate, and every now and then the door would open with that same gentle chime, letting in a breath of cool air along with a new customer, and each time it did, Daniel's eyes would flick toward it before returning to the register, a reflex he did not fully recognize, yet could not stop, and the teenage employee noticed, though he said nothing, just followed Daniel's gaze once or twice before going back to stacking cups or wiping the counter in motions that felt more careful than before, and the child who had been watching earlier was gone now, leaving behind only the faint echo of his curiosity, and the store settled into a quieter rhythm, one that left space for thoughts that had no place during the usual noise, and Daniel found himself replaying the moment again, not the words he had said, but the ones he had not, the space between them, the way Marcus had stood there without raising his voice, without demanding anything, and still changed the entire room, and that realization stayed with him longer than he expected, like a sound that continued after it should have faded. And he reached for the small cup again, lifting it this time, feeling the warmth that had already begun to fade, and he stared at it for a second before setting it back down, still not drinking it, as if it was not meant for him. and one of the regular customers approached, an older man who came in every afternoon at nearly the same time, ordering the same black coffee without sugar, and Daniel greeted him with a nod. The exchange familiar, predictable, grounding, and yet when he handed over the cup, their fingers brushed slightly, and the man looked at him a little longer than usual, not questioning, just observing, as if he had noticed something different but could not quite name it. And Daniel held that gaze for a second before looking away, returning to the register, and the door chimed again, softer this time, and Daniel did not look up immediately, finishing the transaction in front of him before finally glancing toward the entrance, and for a split second, his breath paused, not because Marcus had returned, but because he realized he had expected him to, and that expectation felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if it required something from him he had not yet decided to give. And the customer stepped inside, a woman with a folded newspaper under her arm, and the moment passed, the door closing behind her, the street outside returning to its quiet movement. And Daniel exhaled slowly, setting his shoulders back into place, and the teenage employee leaned closer again, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation between them. "You keep looking at the door," he said, not accusing, just stating what was visible, and Daniel hesitated, then gave a small, almost reluctant smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Just making sure everything is running smoothly," he replied, though even he could hear the thinness in that explanation, and the employee nodded, not pressing further, but his expression suggested he understood more than the words had said, and the minutes stretched, the light outside shifting again as clouds moved slowly across the sky, softening the brightness that filtered through the windows, and Daniel's gaze drifted once more to the spot on the counter where the coins had been, and without thinking, he reached into the register drawer and pulled out a few coins, placing them gently on the surface in almost the same arrangement, not exact, not deliberate, just enough to mirror what had been there before, and he stared at them, the small circles of metal catching the light in quiet reflections, and something about that image felt heavier now, more significant, and he tapped one lightly with his finger, the sound sharp, distinct, and it echoed in the silence between orders, and he imagined, just for a moment, what it would feel like to stand on the other side of the counter, to be the one holding those coins instead of counting them, and the thought lingered longer than he expected, settling into a place he had not explored before, and he shook his head slightly, as if to clear it, returning his attention to the next customer, but the image stayed, persistent, and the door chimed again, and this time, Daniel looked immediately, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, and again, it was not Marcus, just another passerby stepping into the store, and yet the disappointment that followed was real, subtle but undeniable, and he turned back to the counter, the coins still there, the small cup still waiting, and he realized, quietly, that the moment had not ended when Marcus walked out. It had only changed shape, continuing in ways he had not expected, asking questions he had not prepared to answer, and the store moved on around him, orders placed, coffee poured, receipts printed, but beneath it all, something remained, steady, present, like a quiet reminder that what had happened was not just an interruption. It was something that had taken root, something that would not leave simply because the door had closed. The coins Daniel had placed on the counter caught the late afternoon light in a way that made them look brighter than they were, small reflections stretching across the smooth surface like quiet echoes of something unfinished, and he stood there for a second longer than necessary, staring at them as if they might rearrange themselves into an answer, while the hum of the store continued around him, steady, predictable, almost too normal for what he was feeling, and he reached out, nudging one coin slightly, then another, aligning them into a straighter line, not because it mattered, but because it gave his hand something to do, something simple in a moment that no longer felt simple, and behind him, the teenage employee called out an order, his voice returning to its usual rhythm, but even that sounded different now, softer, more aware, as if the room itself had learned to lower its volume, and Daniel glanced toward the door again, not quickly this time, but with intention, holding the look for a second longer, watching the street outside where people moved past without noticing the small shift that had taken place inside, and he wondered, not for the first time, where Marcus had gone, whether he had stopped somewhere else, whether he had found another place that saw him or another that did not, and the thought stayed with him longer than he expected, settling into a quiet place he had not visited before, and he picked up the small cup again, the one he had set aside earlier, and this time he brought it closer, not to drink, but to feel the weight of it, lighter now as the heat faded, and he turned it slightly in his hand, watching the surface ripple faintly, reflecting the overhead lights in soft circles, and something about that reflection reminded him of the coins, of the way small things could carry more than they seemed, and he set the cup back down, exactly where it had been, as if its position mattered, as if it was waiting for something he had not yet decided, and a customer approached, placing a few crumpled bills on the counter for a coffee, and Daniel processed the order automatically, his hands moving with practiced ease, but his eyes lingered on the money for a second longer than usual, noticing the folds, the way each piece had its own history, and he handed back the change carefully, not sliding it across the counter like before, but placing it directly into the customer's hand, a small adjustment that felt significant in a way he could not fully explain, and the customer paused, just briefly, as if recognizing the difference, then nodded and stepped away, and the teenage employee watched that exchange, his expression thoughtful, and after a moment he spoke again, quieter this time. "You did not have to say what you said earlier," he said, not accusing, not judging, just stating what had already been felt, and Daniel did not respond immediately, his gaze dropping to the coins on the counter again, the ones he had arranged, the ones that now felt like more than just loose change, and he tapped one lightly, the sound sharp but contained, and he let out a slow breath. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but lower than before. "I did not." And the admission hung there, simple and unguarded, and the employee nodded once, accepting it without pushing further, and the store moved on, orders filling, cups stacking, the rhythm continuing, but Daniel found himself moving differently within it, more deliberate, more aware of each interaction, each word, each glance, and the door chimed again, and this time, he did not just look, he listened, the sound of it clearer, more distinct, and he felt something shift in his chest, a quiet anticipation that had not been there before, and when the door opened, it was not Marcus, just another customer stepping in from the street. But Daniel did not look away immediately. He held the moment, acknowledging it, then turned back to the counter, and the coins were still there, the small line he had made now slightly uneven again, and he reached out, not to fix them this time, but to gather them into his hand, feeling their weight against his palm, and he closed his fingers around them for a second, holding that weight, that reminder, before opening his hand again and setting them back down, not in a line, not in a pile, just leaving them as they fell, and something about that felt more honest, less controlled, and he glanced at the small cup once more, then at the door, then back at the counter, and for the first time since Marcus had left, he stepped out from behind it, just one step, enough to feel the difference in position, enough to see the room from another angle, and the teenage employee noticed, his eyebrows lifting slightly, but he said nothing, and Daniel stood there for a second, the space unfamiliar. The perspective changed, and he looked toward the door again, not as a boundary this time, but as a possibility, and the thought did not leave him quickly. It stayed, quiet and persistent, like the echo of a moment that had not finished speaking yet. Daniel did not step back behind the counter right away, and that small decision lingered in the space. Like a quiet shift no one announced, his shoes now on the same side where customers stood, the distance between him and the door no longer divided by polished laminate or routine, and he let his eyes adjust to this new angle, noticing things he had not before, the slight scuff marks on the floor near the entrance, the way the sunlight angled through the glass and stretched across the tiles in long pale stripes, the faint reflection of passing cars sliding over the window like slow-moving shadows, and for a moment he simply stood there, hands at his sides, feeling the difference without trying to explain it, while behind him the register beeped softly, a reminder that the store still needed him, that the rhythm had not stopped just because he had stepped out of it, and the teenage employee glanced over, waiting for him to return, but Daniel did not move immediately, instead taking one more look toward the door, holding it longer this time, as if expecting something not just to appear, but to mean something when it did, and when nothing changed, when the street remained just a street and the door just a door, He exhaled slowly and turned back, walking around the counter instead of stepping directly behind it, his path deliberate, his pace steady, and as he reached his usual position, it felt slightly unfamiliar, like returning to a place that had not changed but no longer felt the same. And he rested his hands on the counter again, but this time his grip was lighter. His fingers relaxed instead of braced, and he looked down at the coins he had left scattered there, their arrangement no longer neat, no longer controlled, just small pieces of metal resting where they had fallen, and he did not move them, did not fix them, just let them be. And the teenage employee leaned closer, lowering his voice again. "You went out there," he said, not questioning, just noting, and Daniel gave a small nod, his eyes still on the counter. "Just for a second," he replied, though the weight of that second felt longer than it sounded, and the employee hesitated, then added, "It looked different, did it not?" And Daniel paused, considering the words, then looked up briefly, meeting the younger man's gaze. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it did," and the honesty in that answer settled between them. Simple but real, and the next customer stepped forward, placing an order in a voice that carried a hint of the earlier silence, as if even routine had learned to soften, and Daniel processed it carefully, repeating the order back without rushing, his tone even, measured, and when he handed over the change, he did it the same way as before, placing it directly into the customer's hand, and the gesture, small as it was, seemed to carry through the rest of the interaction, making it slower, more present, and the customer nodded, a brief acknowledgement that felt different from the ones that had come earlier, and stepped aside, and the line moved forward, each person stepping into the space with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and between transactions, Daniel's gaze kept returning to the door, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a steady curiosity, as if it represented something he had only just begun to understand. And outside, the light shifted again, the sun dipping lower, casting longer shadows that stretched across the floor, touching the edge of the counter, the base of the coffee machines, the scattered coins that still caught the fading brightness in soft glints. And Daniel watched those reflections for a moment, the way they changed as the light moved, and something about that movement reminded him of the moment itself, how it had shifted, how it had changed shape without disappearing, and he reached out, not to gather the coins this time, but to push one slightly toward the edge, watching it roll just a fraction before stopping, and the sound it made was small, contained, but it echoed in his mind in a way that felt larger, and he let his hand rest there for a second, then pulled it back, and the teenage employee followed the motion with his eyes, then looked up at Daniel again. "Do you think he meant what he said?" he asked, his tone thoughtful, not skeptical, and Daniel did not answer. Immediately, his gaze returning to the door, then to the counter, then back again, as if the answer existed somewhere between those 2 points, and after a moment, he nodded once, slow, certain. "Yeah," he said, "I think he did." And the words carried a quiet weight, not because they were loud, but because they were believed. And the employee nodded in return, accepting that without question, and the store continued, the hum of machines, the soft murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of cups and coins and receipts. But beneath it all, something remained, a subtle shift in how things were seen, how they were held, and Daniel felt it in every small action, every glance, every pause, and when the door chimed again, he looked up without hesitation, not because he expected Marcus to return, but because he understood now that the moment was not about whether he came back. It was about what stayed behind, and as the door opened and another customer stepped in, the light from outside spilling briefly across the floor, Daniel held that understanding for a second longer, letting it settle fully before turning back to the counter, ready, not just to continue, but to do it differently than before. The late afternoon light settled into a softer tone, stretching longer across the floor and touching everything with a quiet warmth that did not match the fluorescent hum above, and Daniel noticed it this time. Really noticed it. The way it reached the edge of the counter and stopped just short of the coins, as if the light itself respected some invisible boundary, and he stood there watching it for a moment between orders, his hands resting lightly on the surface, not gripping, not claiming, just present, and the store moved around him in a steady rhythm, voices low, movements measured, each interaction carrying a trace of the earlier shift, like a memory that refused to fade, and the teenage employee moved with a little more care now, placing cups instead of sliding them, speaking instead of calling out, and even the regulars seemed to sense it, their tone softer, their pace slower, as if something had asked them, silently, to pay attention, and Daniel glanced again at the coins, still scattered where he had left them, catching the last pieces of daylight in faint glimmers, and he reached out, not to organize them, not to count them, but simply to touch one, pressing it lightly against the counter and feeling its solid edge under his fingertip, grounding, real, and the small contact carried more weight than he expected, like holding onto something that could not be dismissed, and he pulled his hand back slowly, letting the coin settle where it was, and the door chimed again, the sound clearer now, more distinct in the quieter room, and Daniel looked up immediately, not out of habit, but with intention, and for a split second, something in his chest tightened, not hope exactly, but something close to it, and when the door opened, it was still not Marcus, just a couple stepping in from the street, their conversation pausing as they took in the room, sensing the atmosphere before speaking again in softer voices, and Daniel nodded to them, a small acknowledgement that felt different from the automatic greetings he had used before, and he turned back to the counter, processing the next order with the same deliberate care, repeating each item, placing each cup with precision, handing over change directly into open hands, and each action felt like a choice now, not a routine, and between customers, the teenage employee leaned closer once more, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is strange," he said, glancing at the coins, then at the door, "how one moment can stay like that." And Daniel followed his gaze, then nodded slowly. "It is not the moment," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. "It is what it shows you." And the words seemed to settle into the space between them, understood without needing to be explained, and the employee nodded again, his expression thoughtful, as if he was turning that idea over in his mind. And the store continued, the rhythm steady, the light fading gradually as the sun dipped lower, the reflections on the floor shifting and softening until they nearly disappeared, and the coins no longer caught the light the same way, their brightness dimming into something quieter, more subdued, and Daniel noticed that too, the way their presence remained even when the shine was gone, and he reached out once more, this time gathering them slowly into his palm, not counting, not measuring, just holding them, feeling their combined weight, and he closed his hand around them. For a second, letting that weight settle, before opening his fingers again and placing them back down, not scattered this time, not arranged, just set gently in a small cluster near the edge of the counter, and he stepped back half an inch, looking at them from a slight distance, and something about that placement felt right, not because it was neat, but because it was intentional, and the door chimed again, and this time Daniel did not rush to look, he simply turned his head, calm, present, and the evening air slipped in briefly before the door closed, carrying with it the faint sound of traffic, distant voices, a world continuing beyond the glass, and Daniel held that awareness for a moment, the connection between inside and outside clearer now, less divided, and he returned to the counter, to the next customer, to the steady flow of the store, but the difference remained, not loud, not obvious, just there, in every pause, every glance, every small decision. And as the last of the daylight faded and the artificial lights took over completely, casting their consistent glow across the room, Daniel realized that the moment had not ended with Marcus leaving. It had settled into him, into the space, into the way things were done, and it would stay, not as a memory to be replayed, but as something quieter, something that shaped what came next without asking permission. And he looked once more at the door, then at the coins, then back at the customers in front of him. And for the first time since it all began, there was no tension in that movement, just a steady understanding that what mattered had already happened, and what remained was how he chose to carry it forward. The evening settled fully over the storefront, the last traces of daylight fading into a muted gray that pressed softly against the glass, and the artificial lights inside took over completely, steady and unchanging, casting their pale glow across the counter, the machines, the small cluster of coins that still rested where Daniel had left them, and for a moment he stood still again, not because the store had stopped, but because something in him had, just long enough to notice the difference between what the room had been and what it had become, and the hum of the coffee machine filled the quiet spaces between voices, a low constant sound that seemed almost grounding now. And Daniel reached for the small paper cup he had set aside earlier, the one that had been waiting longer than any order should. And this time he lifted it with intention, bringing it closer, feeling the warmth that had nearly disappeared, the heat now faint, almost gone, and he looked at it for a second before taking a small sip. The taste simple, familiar, unchanged, and yet it felt different, not because the coffee had changed, but because he had. And he set the cup back down slowly, not in its original place, but closer to the coins, as if those two things now belonged in the same space, connected by something unspoken. And behind him the teenage employee called out another order, his voice steady, but quieter than it had been earlier in the day, and Daniel turned to complete the transaction, his movements calm, deliberate, each step measured. And when he handed the cup to the customer, their eyes met briefly, and there was a small pause, not uncomfortable, just present, as if both of them were aware of something that did not need to be said. And the customer nodded, a simple acknowledgement, and stepped away, and the line moved forward again, but the rhythm remained different, slower, more intentional, and Daniel found himself paying attention in a way he had not before, noticing the way each person approached the counter, the way they spoke, the way they held their money, their cups, their time, and each interaction felt like a choice now, not an automatic response. And between customers, his gaze returned to the coins once more, and he reached out, picking them up again, not all at once, but one by one, feeling each piece between his fingers, the edges smooth, the weight small but undeniable. And he remembered the way Marcus had placed them down, not hurried, not ashamed, just steady. And that memory settled into his movements, guiding them without effort. And he placed the coins back down again, this time closer together, not arranged, not counted, just held in a quiet cluster. And the teenage employee watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You are thinking about it," he said softly, and Daniel did not deny it this time, did not deflect. He simply nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I am." And the admission felt different now, less like a confession, more like an acknowledgement of something that was already clear. And the employee leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze drifting to the door, then back to Daniel. "Do you think it changed anything?" he asked, and Daniel paused, his eyes following the same path, from the coins to the door to the customers moving through the space. And he took a breath before answering. Not quickly, not automatically, but with care. "It already did," he said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet certainty that did not need to be proven. And the employee nodded slowly, accepting that, and the store continued. The hum, the voices, the steady flow of orders, but beneath it all, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Daniel felt it in the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he looked at the door each time it chimed, not expecting, not waiting, but understanding that what had passed through it earlier had left something behind that would remain. And as the evening wore on and the line thinned again, the space grew quieter, the pauses longer, and Daniel found himself stepping away from the counter once more, not out of habit, but by choice, moving toward the front of the store, closer to the door. And he stopped there for a second, looking out through the glass at the street beyond, the passing cars, the distant figures, the world continuing in its steady motion. And he held that view for a moment, not searching, not expecting, just seeing it differently than before. And then he turned back, walking to the counter again, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed, and he picked up the small cup once more, finishing the last of the now lukewarm coffee. And he set it down beside the coins, both of them quiet reminders of something that had already taken place. And as the store settled into the slower pace of the evening, Daniel remained where he was, present, aware, no longer just managing the space, but participating in it, in a way that felt new. And when the door chimed again, he looked up, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice, small as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, shaping the way the moment unfolded, even when nothing seemed to happen at all. The night settled deeper outside, the streetlights casting long amber reflections across the glass, and inside the store the brightness remained constant, unchanged, almost too steady compared to the quiet shift that had taken place throughout the day. and Daniel stood near the counter with his hands resting loosely at his sides, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. And the small cluster of coins remained where he had left them, now dull under the artificial light, no longer reflecting the sun, but still carrying the same weight, the same quiet meaning, and the empty paper cup sat beside them, its warmth gone, its purpose fulfilled. Yet neither of them felt like something to be cleared away, and Daniel did not move them, did not reset the space back to what it had been, as if leaving them there mattered, as if removing them would erase something he was not ready to let go of. And the store had grown quieter now. Only a few customers lingering, their voices low, their movements slow, the kind of calm that settles at the end of a long day. And the teenage employee wiped down the far end of the counter, his motion steady, unhurried, glancing occasionally toward Daniel as if checking whether the moment had fully passed or if something still remained. And Daniel noticed that glance but did not comment, instead letting his eyes drift toward the door once more, the glass reflecting both the inside and the outside at once, creating a layered image where the store and the street seemed to exist together, overlapping in a way he had not noticed before. And he took a slow breath, the air inside warm, carrying the faint scent of coffee and sugar, and he realized that the tension that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, and yet it was not empty. It was full of understanding that had not been there before, and he reached out again, not to the coins this time, but to the edge of the counter, resting his palm flat against it, feeling its smooth surface under his hand, grounding himself in the space that had once felt so controlled, so certain, and now felt open in a way he had not expected. And the teenage employee finally spoke. Again, his voice soft but clear in the quiet. "You could have just ignored him," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating a possibility that had already passed. And Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze still on the counter. "I know," he replied. And the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation, and the employee hesitated for a moment before adding, "But you did not." And Daniel lifted his eyes then, meeting the younger man's gaze, and there was no defensiveness there, no need to justify, just a quiet acceptance of what had been done. "No," he said, "I did not." And the words settled between them, not as a regret, but as a recognition. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full, complete, as if both of them understood that something had been learned without needing to name it. And the door chimed again, softer now in the quieter space. And Daniel turned his head, not quickly, not with anticipation, but with a steady awareness, and the door opened just enough to let in a brief gust of cooler air before closing again. A customer stepping in, glancing around before approaching the counter, and Daniel moved to meet them. His steps even, his posture relaxed, and he took the order, with the same calm tone he had been using all evening, repeating it back clearly, placing the cup carefully, handing it over with that same small, deliberate gesture, and the interaction passed smoothly, quietly. And when the customer stepped away, Daniel did not immediately turn back to the register. He paused for a second, looking at the space in front of him, at the coins, at the cup, at the door, and he realized something that had not been clear before, that the moment earlier had not been about proving anything, not about winning or losing, but about seeing, about recognizing something that had been there all along. And he let that realization settle fully before moving again, returning to the steady rhythm of the store. But now each movement felt connected to that understanding. Each action carried a little more weight, a little more intention, and as the night continued and the last customers filtered out, the store grew quieter still, the hum of the machines becoming the dominant sound once more, and the teenage employee finished wiping down the counter, stepping back and looking at the space as if seeing it for the first time. And Daniel followed that gaze, noticing the same details, the same small changes. And when the employee finally headed toward the back room, Daniel remained where he was, standing at the counter, alone for a moment, the coins still there, the empty cup beside them, the door reflecting the dim street outside. And he took one last look at that reflection, at the overlap of inside and outside, and then he reached out, not to remove the coins, not to clear the cup, but simply to rest his hand beside them, acknowledging their presence. And in that quiet gesture, There was no need for words, no need for anything more, because what had been learned did not need to be spoken to. Remained true. The store had nearly emptied, the last customer's footsteps fading into the night as the door closed with a softer sound than before, as if even it understood the weight of the quiet that followed. And Daniel remained at the counter, his hand still resting near the coins, not touching them now, just close enough to feel their presence, while the overhead lights continued their steady hum, casting the same even glow across everything, unchanged, indifferent, and yet the space felt different, fuller, as if something unseen had settled into the air and refused to leave. And Daniel took a slow breath, the scent of coffee lingering, familiar but no longer unnoticed, and he looked down at the coins again, the small cluster that had once been scattered, then arranged, then gathered, now simply there. And he reached out slowly, this time not hesitating, not pausing, just moving with quiet certainty, and he picked them up one by one, feeling each edge against his fingers, the cool metal, grounding him, reminding him of the moment that had shifted everything. And when the last coin left the counter, the surface beneath it looked almost too clean, too empty, as if something important had been removed. And Daniel held the coins in his palm for a second longer than necessary, then walked around the counter, not stopping, not thinking, just moving. And the teenage employee glanced up from the back, surprised by the motion but saying nothing, watching instead as Daniel stepped toward the front of the store, toward the door, the same door he had been looking at all evening. And when he reached it, he paused, his hand hovering just above the handle, not because he was unsure, but because the moment deserved that pause, that acknowledgement. And then he pushed it open, the cool night air slipping in immediately, brushing against his face, carrying the distant sounds of the street, cars passing, voices blending into a low murmur. And he stepped outside, the difference immediate, the space wider, the air sharper, and for a second he just stood there, letting it settle, letting the inside and outside separate clearly in his mind. And then he looked down the sidewalk, not searching, not expecting, just seeing, and the street stretched out in both directions, lit by streetlights that cast long shadows across the pavement. And somewhere in the distance, a figure moved, indistinct, blending into the rhythm of the night. And Daniel took a few steps forward, not far, just enough to leave the doorway behind him, enough to feel the shift fully. And he opened his hand, looking at the coins again, their dull surfaces catching the faint glow of the streetlight. And for a moment he simply held them there, considering, not calculating, not measuring, just understanding. And then he turned slightly, stepping toward the edge of the sidewalk where a small metal donation box was mounted beside a bench, something he had passed countless times without noticing. And he stopped in front of it, the box simple, unmarked except for a small slot at the top. And he did not hesitate this time, did not overthink. He simply lifted his hand and dropped the coins in, one by one, the soft clink of metal echoing faintly inside, a quiet sound that carried more meaning than it should have. And when the last coin fell, he let his hand rest there for a second, then pulled it back, his palm now empty, lighter, and he stood there for a moment longer, looking at the box, then at the street, then back toward the store behind him, the glass reflecting both the inside and the outside, just as it had before. And he saw himself in that reflection, not as he had been earlier, but as he was now, quieter, more aware. And he took a slow breath, letting it out evenly. And then he turned, walking back toward the door, his steps steady, unhurried. And when he reached it, he paused again, just briefly, before stepping inside, the warmth of the store wrapping around him once more, familiar but changed. And the teenage employee looked up as he entered, his expression curious, but he did not ask, did not need to, because something in Daniel's posture, in the way he moved, answered the question before it could be spoken. And Daniel walked back to the counter, his hands empty now, and he looked at the spot where the coins had been, the surface clean, open, and he did not fill it again, did not replace what had been there. He simply rested his hand on it for a moment, then pulled back, and the empty space remained, not lacking, not incomplete, just different. And as the store settled into the final quiet of the night, the hum of the machine steady, the lights constant, Daniel stood there, present, aware, no longer holding on to what had happened, but carrying what it had given him. And the door behind him stood closed, not as a barrier, but as a reminder that what mattered was not who walked through it, but how he chose to meet them when they did. The store settled into its final stillness, the kind that came not from emptiness but from everything finding its place. The machines humming softly, the lights steady and pale, the counter clean except for the faint outline where something had once rested, and Daniel stood there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he understood that leaving this moment too quickly would mean missing what it had become, and he let his hand rest lightly against the counter once more, feeling the smooth surface beneath his palm, the absence where the coins had been no longer feeling like something missing, but something completed, and behind him the teenage employee moved quietly, finishing the last small tasks of the night, stacking cups, straightening lids, his movements careful but no longer uncertain, as if he too had carried something from earlier into this quieter hour, and neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had become enough, and Daniel lifted his gaze toward the door one last time, the glass reflecting the dim streetlights outside, their glow stretching faintly across the floor, and for a second he saw it again, that overlap between inside and outside, between who he had been and who he had chosen to become, and he did not look away from it this time. He held it, steady, accepting, and then he stepped back from the counter, turning slowly as he reached for the lights behind the register, dimming them just slightly, not fully dark, just enough to soften the space, to let the store breathe in a different way, and the shift was immediate, the brightness easing into something warmer, more human, and the teenage employee noticed, glancing up with a small nod, not questioning, just acknowledging. And Daniel returned that nod without words, a quiet understanding, passing between them. And he moved toward the front of the store, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed, no longer carrying the rigid certainty he had worn earlier. And when he reached the door, he paused again, not out of habit, but out of recognition, and he rested his hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath his fingers, the faint vibration of the world outside passing through it. And he looked out once more, not searching, not expecting, just seeing, and the street moved as it always had, cars passing, distant figures walking, life continuing in its steady rhythm, and somewhere within that movement, unseen, Marcus was part of it again, not defined by what had happened inside, but not untouched by it either, and Daniel understood that now, that the moment had not been about holding someone in place, but about letting something move through and leave its mark, and he took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and then he turned back, locking the door, with a soft click that did not feel like an ending, but like a pause, and he walked back toward the counter, the dimmed lights casting softer shadows now, the space quieter, more open, and he stood there for one final moment, looking at the empty spot where the coins had been, at the place where everything had shifted without force, without noise, just through presence, and he did not try to recreate it, did not try to hold on to it. He simply acknowledged it, and then he reached for the small paper cup, now empty, lifting it with a steady hand and placing it into the bin, a simple act that marked the end of something that did not need to be repeated. And when he straightened again, there was no weight in his shoulders, no tension in his hands, just a quiet steadiness that had not been there before, and the store, though unchanged in its structure, felt different in its meaning, shaped by something that would not be seen by everyone who walked through it, but would be felt by those who paid attention. And Daniel took one last look around, the counter, the machines, the door, the reflections, and he understood, without needing to say it, that what had mattered most had not been the words, not the challenge, not even the outcome, but the moment in between, where someone had chosen dignity over noise, and someone else had finally chosen to see it. And as he turned off the final light and stepped toward the back, the store settled into darkness, not empty, but complete, holding within it the quiet echo of something that had changed, something that would remain, long after the door opened again to a new day and a new chance to meet it differently.